So we're in your United States history book. We're in chapter 28, section 2, going on to social movements. The social movements during the Cold War period, which were the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s on into the 1980s. And so this time we're going to talk about some of those civil rights movements that we hear about that happened back then, and on to the Vietnam protests and the women's rights, environmentalism, and other social movements during this time. You can see here, this was a big time of for human rights too, as we see here the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, and on to ending the Vietnam War and Earth Day. Here's a picture of Earth Day. And here's what women's rights are human rights. And so here we have, and now down the bottom here we have Woodstock, and we have the revolution going on, the cultural revolution going on during this time, especially in the 1960s. So let's begin. Civil rights. We're going to talk about Rosa Parks. So in 1950s and 1960s, Black Americans made gains politically and socially through the civil rights movement. On December 1955, Rosa Parks, she lived 1913 to 2005, she boarded a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. All public facilities were segregated with whites in the front of the bus and the blacks in the back of the bus. And so Parks sat in the first row of the black section, but the driver changed that row to be part of the white rows after the white rows were filled and there were no rooms. So he basically told her to move. And so Parks refused to give up her seat. And the bus driver called the police. And guess what? Can you believe that Rosa Parks was arrested for not wanting to give up her seat in the bus because she was black and not white? Oh, I can't even imagine this, but it happened. And to me, Rosa Parks was a very brave lady. So here's a picture of her on the bus, as we see, and here's her being arrested, and she was arrested for not giving up her seat and having to stand up. Martin Luther King Jr., who lived 1929 to 1968, he was a young Black American minister that stepped forward to aid Rosa Parks to help organize a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. Of course, everyone's looking like, oh my goodness, this is horrible, especially if you lived in the North, like I did. Soon, the bus company was losing money. So in 1956, the Supreme Court in the South ordered Montgomery to disintegrate the bus system. So basically that order that came, it wasn't the Supreme Court, but it was the Supreme South order from Montgomery. So King's civil rights campaign soon spread nationwide. Martin Luther King helped form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, called SCLC, in 1957. The group pledged to nonviolent resistance in the struggle for civil rights and planned marches and demonstrations to protest racial segregation. So Martin Luther King, a young Black minister, takes the lead in civil rights in the South, from especially dealing with the issue of segregation. So what happens next? The civil rights advancements start happening. In the South, department stores discovered that Black Americans would not spend money in a store with segregated facilities. Lunch counters with certain sections reserved for whites only, so Black college students began to sit-ins at these counters to make a statement that they were allowed to sit there. On May 14th, 1961, riots began in Anniston and Birmingham, Alabama, in the response to Freedom Riders. What were the Freedom Riders? The Freedom Riders toured the South by bus to protest the local segregation laws. The Freedom Riders arrived in Montgomery, Alabama on May 20th, causing Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the president's brother was Attorney General then, to send federal marshals to Alabama, to its capital, to restore order in Montgomery. Segregation was banned in all facilities used by interstate buses then. So you see here, the Freedom Riders, basically, they rode the buses and they sat in those areas that they were not supposed to sit in. And so this caused a lot of problems in the South. You wouldn't think it would. Now, as we look back, we think this is totally ridiculous. But that was coming out of the time of the Civil War when blacks were slaves and they were segregated into the black bathrooms and the black part of the bus and all this. And so basically these Freedom Riders, they rode the buses, and of course they would do it peacefully, but this caused violence in some cases. So we see riots breaking out in Birmingham, Alabama, and on down to Montgomery, Alabama. So here we have a picture there. I don't know what happened there, but of course it looks like looks like some type of a bomb. And then on to the guarding, basically when Robert F. Kennedy sent marshals to Alabama's capital to restore order here. The marshals are guarding them so that they could sit wherever they want. So these are the Freedom Riders. You can see here, the table here, it says, this is closed, the table is closed. They wouldn't let them sit there, but they sat there, just making a point that we should not be segregated. We should not be persecuted, really, because we're of a different race. James Meredith in 1933, he lived up till now. The fall of 1962, in the fall time, James Meredith began the first Black American attempt to enroll at an all-white University of Mississippi. White extremist groups threatened his life, so President Kennedy sent 5,000 troops to the campus to enable him to register as a student. In 1963, Congress passed legislation withholding government business from discriminated establishments. So at this time, James Meredith decided he wanted to go to college at the University of Mississippi, and he would be the first Black student. Well, of course, they didn't want to let him in. They didn't want him to enroll, but President Kennedy sent how many troops? 5,000 troops. That's really making a statement back then. 5,000 troops to the University of Mississippi. So he was the first African-American student to attend school there, needless to say. And this actually caused Congress to pass the legislation that basically said that you could not be discriminatory in business, in government or business at that point, or now in the universities. Martin Luther King's speech. In 1963, the most dramatic moment in the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King addressed about 250,000 people from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, calling for an end to discrimination. You see him there. He says, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream." So here we have him. Here we have Martin Luther King standing, giving his famous speech in 1963. Here's what he says here. "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." Basically saying it's time to stand up for rights, the rights of people, and the civil rights of African Americans. And indeed, it was. And it is now to stand for the rights of any human being. I'm going to go over some of these famous Black Americans. This is in your book, and this was an insert in here, so I thought it worthy to go through them real quick. And this is in history. Benjamin Banneker lived 1731 to 1806. He was an engineer who helped survey the boundaries for the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. He was an astronomer, a farmer, and a mathematician. Here he is right here. Lemuel Hayes, 1753 to 1833, right here. He was a Congregational minister who served as a Minuteman and a Patriot soldier during Americans' War for Independence. He was a Minuteman. Jim Beckwourth in 1798 to 1867 was a pioneer who explored the West, traveling with John C. Fremont and Kit Carson. Here he is. It's so amazing because John C. Fremont and his wife Jessie, they were dynamic in the cause a cause against discrimination in the abolition movement at that time, and against slavery. And so basically, when I look at them, John C. Fremont, the great pathfinder, he explored with Jim Beckwourth, who was African American. Frederick Douglass, 1818 to 1895, an abolitionist called the spokesman for his race. He fought slavery through his newspaper. He had a newspaper and even advised President Lincoln during the Civil War. So here's a picture of Frederick Douglass. He's probably one of the most famous abolitionists, and speakers of the time before slavery. We're talking way back during the Civil War. Some more famous Black Americans. Fanny Jackson Copen, 1837 to 1913, was an educator who served as principal of the Institute for Colored Youth from 1869 to 1902. And then she left for the mission field in Africa and brought the gospel to Africa. Here's a picture of Fanny, quite an evangelist. So on to James Weldon Johnson, 1871 to 1938. He was a poet and statesman, best known for the Creation from God's Trombones collection of Black sermons in verse. So he was a U.S. consul in Venezuela and Nicaragua. So a statesman and a poet and a writer. Mary McLeod Bethune, 1875 to 1955. She graduated from Moody Bible Institute. She was an educator and dedicated her life to improving education for Black Americans. She was the first Black American to head a federal agency, the Division of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration. So here she is there, Mary Bethune. Few other more Black Americans. Benjamin O. Davis Sr., 1877 to 1970s when he lived. He was the first Black American to achieve the rank of the Brigadier General in the Army. Brigadier General of the Army. So he was very much involved, at that time in the war. Marian Anderson, 1897 to 1993, was a talented contralto and became the first Black American to sing at the Metropolis Opera. Here is a picture of her. So on to Mahalia Jackson, 1911 to 1972, world-renowned singer for her soul performance of gospel songs and hymns. She said, "They were not songs of despair, but gospel songs are the songs of hope. When you sing them, you are delivered of your burdens." So we have Mahalia singing gospel songs. So Edward Brooke, 1919 to 2015, was a Massachusetts senator for the first Black American to be elected to the Senate. Daniel Chappie James Jr., 1920 to 1978, was a 4-star general in the United States Air Force, commanded also the North American Air Defense from 1975 to 1977. He played important roles in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam as a combat pilot. He said that he would be glad to fight in 3 more wars to defend his country. Here we have Daniel Chappie James Jr. So this was Edward Brooke, and this here was Mahalia Jackson, and this over here was Marian Anderson. I might have got those two mixed up, so I wanted to clarify that. So at the Metropolitan Opera is where Marian sang. Gaining national prominence, Bloody Sunday. Okay, what is Bloody Sunday? In 1965, Martin Luther King led a planned march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, to raise awareness of the political and social injustices in the South. On Sunday, March 7th, 1965, several hundred peaceful protesters began the march, but they were confronted by authorities with a brutal attack, and many were hospitalized. This is on March 7th. The event is called Bloody Sunday, as on a Sunday, and gained in the civil rights movement national support as television cameras recorded the entire event. You can see how people are thinking, what is going on? And then President Johnson supported a Voting Rights Act too, and King and his followers officially completed their peaceful protest in late March. So even though today was Bloody Sunday, they went on with their marches to the point that the Civil Rights Acts were coming through Congress. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy. Of the leaders of the civil rights movement, none had matched the stature of Martin Luther King. He insisted on nonviolent demonstrations to end discrimination. In 1968, on a visit to Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King was assassinated by James Earl Ray. Since then, people of all ethnicities have been striving to realize King's dream that people not be judged by their color, but rather by their character. So here we have Martin Luther King, his life cut short at a young age. He says here, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Isn't that the way it is with Jesus? We need Jesus. Darkness can't drive out darkness, but only light. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. I love what he said there. And that is his Strength to Love in 1963. So despite all of this, he wanted to bring forth the love of God. It's a picture of Martin Luther King before Dr. King was slain in Memphis. And here is James Earl Ray. Now again, there are some, even Martin Luther King's family now think there were some conspiracies other than just James Earl Ray, that so far those haven't been proven, although I think there may have been as many assassinations as we had back then with the same time frame, of President Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. But anyway, he was young, to be too. And so we wonder as time went on, what greater things he could have done, but we're going to see him in heaven for sure. Other approaches to civil rights. So many Southerners resented federal officials telling their state and local governments what to do. And many had a very difficult time of changing their ways. Some took the law into their own hands, or even joined the supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. So we did have racism going on in the South, especially the Ku Klux Klan, basically persecuting and killing people, very racist. So some separatist groups like Black Panthers also supported segregation for their own reasons. Malcolm X, who lived 1925 to 1965, considered Martin Luther King's methods too peaceful and too slow. He wanted to assert Black power, calling for a segregation of races to preserve Black culture. So he wanted to keep the races segregated, He didn't want the races mixing either, but he wanted to bring in Black power. And Malcolm X, the whole thing being right here, of course, Black Panther Party here, and it basically, in the midst of this is where they started worshiping Allah, very Muslim background. In 1965, rival Black Muslim leaders hired a gunman who murdered Malcolm X. So they had rival Muslim groups, working for control. So this was not the way to do it. Martin Luther King had the peaceful movement that he had made a lot of, brought a lot of light, I should say, where darkness, and of course darkness can't cast out darkness, So the Black Panther movement was definitely a Muslim radical movement in the midst as another another wrong approach, I should say, to civil rights. We know the right approach would be through Jesus Christ. Vietnam protests. So the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, warned that the Soviet influence was growing on college campuses in high-ranking government circles. And so he said, in college, there's a lot of communism, there's a lot of things going on in the college. Of course, a lot of the college age kids were the age of having to be drafted to go to war too. So college students and professors openly avowed communist beliefs and some sympathies in some of the colleges. And many students held demonstrations against the Vietnam War. Some burned their draft cards and defaced the American flag in hatred towards America. And the most radical bombed buildings used by the Reserve Officers Training Corps, the ROTC, they bombed the building. But most Americans remained patriotic, and these anti-American acts disgusted them. So we had, of course, that's what happened. Communism goes and infiltrates the colleges, just like they do. That's one of the tactics through any type of protest. Making things worse so they could come in and take over and say, communism has the answer. And that's what they were doing in the colleges, in a lot of the colleges. So here we have some of the protests here. Here we have Veterans for Peace, Get Out of Vietnam. That was for the end of the Vietnam War. So all these things were going on. And of course, the war was going on as a no-win war for too long of a time. And there was a lot of political problems in the midst of all this too. So it was just really a horrific time in the United States of America as government too. So, and now we have protests going on top that have become violent, some of them becoming violent. Frustration and division. Frustrated with the slow process of the Vietnam War, many Americans began to oppose the struggle for freedom in South Vietnam. In South Vietnam, the South Vietnamese wanted freedom, but as the government reacted, we didn't see, as Johnson stopped any bombing of the North Vietnam bases, and the war just seemed to linger and linger. So no one really knew. They thought, are we really standing up for peace for them or what? So you can imagine, America was divided. The Hawks supported the fight for South Vietnam. The Doves, who were soft towards communism in many ways, opposed the war because America seemed to be losing the war, they thought. So these are two extremes. Much of the coverage on television caused opposition to the war, as basically the media was giving forth a lot of propaganda in the subject, So the media, of course, show the worst of the worst. The media can change a lot of people's minds by what they show in their reporting of a war. Many reporters capitalized on the bloodshed. They thought, more bloodshed, more people are going to watch, right? And few people realized the true nature of the conflict. back in that time, sometimes they would film, and, you could imagine if you were a family and you saw your son there or something. So it was a time that was very, volatile, you could say. So here we have some pictures. I'm going home. Here we have the pictures of protest, and this is at the Capitol, the Washington Memorial there, you can see there. So it says down here, folk singers were the first to write protest songs, and then rock resonated protest. Anti-war music was the catalyst that united those against the war. So there was a lot of war music, or should I say protest against the war music. It appealed especially to the younger generations, and these songs often played in the colleges, and they were drafting. The drafting aroused anti-war sentimentism in basically the younger generations. Anyway, here's the picture. I was trying to read that, kind of hard to read that, but here we have the music that was playing in the colleges and stuff. And so here's the sign for peace, and I like here, this picture up here in this corner is Barry McGuire, Eve of Destruction, saying we're living in the eve of destruction. He was like a rock. He was in the rock band Hair and all this and everything, and he got saved dramatically, and now he's led. Since then, he's older than me, and this whole time he's led thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to the Lord Jesus Christ. So I have to say, during this time, it was so volatile and so confusing. But when the light truly came in, when Jesus came in, a lot of these hippies and protesters, a lot of them got saved and on fire for the Lord. That's what I have to see. There was a great Jesus movement that happened right on the end of the whole protest of the Vietnam War. Anti-war protests continue. So in 1969, President Nixon began withdrawing the troops from South Vietnam. But in April of 1970, he ordered more troops to Cambodia to destroy the communist bases. And so Vietnam protesters then accused him of expanding the war and going back on his promise. He said he's going to withdraw the troops, and then he said, oh, we need more troops for Cambodia. So they looked at him like, what? He does not stand behind what he says he's going to do. So angry and violent demonstrations on the college campuses led to the deaths of 4 students at Kent State University in Ohio and 2 students at Jackson State University in Mississippi. So here's 4 protesters that were killed. Here's the pictures of what happened at Kent State. So Nixon accelerated the withdrawal from Vietnam. The anti-war sentiment at home proved to make the situation worse abroad, as many American soldiers felt that their nation was unappreciated of their sacrifice. So you can imagine if you were a young man, a soldier, and your country was not supporting you, and they were protesting. And when you came home, that they didn't say give you a hero's welcome, but they spit on you and caused you being disgraced for your service as you stood in Vietnam to support America. So it was very ambiguous time. It's a very time that was very volatile between young people all over, and especially in America. Women's rights. So women began seeking a greater role in society. In the 1950s, society expected women to take care of the home. We know that. And during the war, of course, a lot of women, went and worked during that time, but they went home back in the 1950s to start their families as the soldiers came back from war. But increasingly more women joined the workforce in the next decades. So in 1950, 34% were in the workforce. In 1990, 58% were in the workforce. In 1976 to 1985, the UN observed the decade for women for further equality for women worldwide. So we have a lot more women careers, equal positions with equal pay now, really good careers, but you have a woman coming in, an equal opportunity employer, try to get through that barrier there. But anyway, here we have women's rights. Equal Pay Act in 1963. In 1960s, the Congress passed laws preventing employment discrimination based on race or sex. So Equal Pay Act prevented women from earning less than what a man would be paid for the same tasks. The first wave of feminists from 1850s to 1920s, they sought for suffrage, abolition, prohibition. The women, they were strong women standing for women's rights. But the second wave came in, feminists in the 1960s to 1970s. They fought for equality in every area of life, but also they stood up for legal rights for abortions for all women. So it was getting to the point that it was going to extremes in the midst, even standing up with some women saying their hatred for men, I saw. But here we said of the first ladies here basically standing up here and saying we refuse to be second-class workers. It was all, good. Judge women as to be people, not just wives, some of these things. But as they went on, it became more radical and to a radical level that was got to be even to the point of being immoral. So I'm going to stop there because we're going to have a few other things to discuss, especially when it comes to Roe versus Wade. So let's stop there and we'll go on in the next video.